Where do you think the foundations of your political beliefs came from? I know you have a hefty collection of presidential biographies.
Yeah, that's right. It's really interesting. Grew up in College Station, Texas. Definitely had some interesting experiences there. I think the foundation of my political beliefs all come from the Iraq War. So you guys are too young, but I was in, I think, intermediate school. I was in like fifth grade during the Iraq War. I think it was in third grade on 9/11. And I just remember vehemently being against the war. And my town was very pro-war, very pro-Bush. It was a town with the College Station library. It was College Station, which has the George Bush Presidential Library in it. And so, it was very difficult. And I kind of was brought up, I was always been kind of a rebel against power structures. And so that really was like the formative part of my experience. I got to DC. I interned for my congressman, who at that time was a Democrat, but it was very, these type of Democrats which don't even exist anymore. He represented a R plus 32 district, which means that it votes Republican in the presidential election by 32 points. But he was a Democrat, one of the most conservative Democrats in Congress. He lost the year that I actually got that internship, which kind of sucked. Ended up being good for me. And it really was just like indicative of there's a huge change happening in politics, like the type of politician that I, saw myself as a part of, just really can't even get elected anymore. It was my first exposure. I was a student, I was only 18 here in DC, and to real national politics, like working on Capitol Hill. So I wouldn't give anything for it. It was literally my first day of classes, was my first day as an intern. And I was really young. And I'm so glad that that happened to me, because you really just got hit in the face with it at a young and early age.
Definitely, that's really cool. I worked with the Andrew Yang campaign from very, very early on, and you guys talk about him on your show a lot, and I was just wondering. So, of course, he was a 2020 presidential candidate. Who, I guess, if you're comfortable saying, who was
Sure.
your favorite presidential candidate, in the 2020 election, and I guess
So
why?
I really liked Andrew Yang, obviously. I enjoyed, I don't know, honestly, there were elements of pretty much all of them, which I appreciated. I thought Joe Biden had some decent answers on questions. He was definitely kind of at war with the woke wing of the Democratic Party. There were a lot of stuff that Bernie Sanders said that I agree with. There's a lot of stuff that Donald Trump said, which I agreed with. I guess the only people I didn't like were all of those people who were challenging Trump from the Never Trump side. So like Joe Walsh's of the world or whatever, who was like, actually, this is all about just cutting taxes and things like that. So yeah, there's pretty much no candidate which I didn't at one time or another appreciate something that they said. I think Kamala Harris might be up there. She might be on the list of somebody I didn't particularly like. So there you go.
So you mentioned wokeness, and I would love to hear some more of your opinions about woke culture, especially in 2021.
Well, it's really interesting. I think that wokeness, quote unquote, is the reason that Trump came so close to winning the election in 2020. And it's kind of amazing from my perspective. I mean, here you have a person who ran as a populist, who did not govern in a populist way, really, all that side outside of the China trade war. The only legislative accomplishment he had under him was a massive tax cut for the rich, kind of Paul Ryan's dream. And yet, I mean, he won more union votes than he did in 2016. How do you explain that? And I think the only way to explain that is a backlash against elite liberal culture, which is pushing different ideas, well, not even different ideas, which is pushing kind of a monomaniacal view that this is the only way, it's the way that must be accepted, and is marching its way through our institutions. So in media and in business, HR departments, I think that if you look actually at some of the data in terms of there are very few swing voters in America today. It almost pretty much like doesn't exist. But one of the only groups of swing voters, Clinton to Trump voters, the coveted, you voted against me last time, you voted for me this time, was because of defund the police. I think that that is a profound statement on both that slogan, on the caricature and the direction of woke culture in America. And I think that Joe Biden's rejection of woke politics is why he's the president of the United States. I think if it was anybody else up on that stage, I don't think they could have made it. honestly. I think they're just too susceptible, and they're younger, really. And so they have different value set. They remember a different time in politics. And I think they would have lost against Trump.
Great. So you mentioned sort of the rise of Trump. You alluded to it a little bit, and I, I think that that's something that people have, begun to sort of investigate more and more. What do you think were the biggest factors that can explain the rise of Trump?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I have done a lot of rethinking on this question after 2020, given how many votes that he was able to win. And actually, a clue to the very beginning, if you had to pick like one thing, obviously there's macro stuff like Iraq, financial crisis, NAFTA, TPP. Everybody knows the list. But if you were to pick a really interesting moment, Obama himself pointed out in his book, in The Promised Land, he said that whenever you guys, again, you're too young to even remember this. It was 2009. And there was this incident where a Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think he was a Harvard professor, Henry Louis Gates, and he had an experience. It's like a bad experience with a cop. And I don't really remember what it was. I think the guy like came into his house. Anyway, so it was 2009. And Obama in a Rose Garden press conference said, quote, "The police acted stupidly." And it was that quote, according to Obama himself, that caused his numbers amongst working class whites to plummet, and he never recovered from that. And I think Obama never was able to resist taking the bait on many of these different cultural flashpoints, Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin. I mean, I could go on and on in terms of just these like little cultural flashpoint things that he and his administration would lean into. And that's really what set for the rise of Trump. I mean, if you go and you think back to what is it exactly that led blue collar, white working class voters to revolt against Democrats, if I could point to a single event, it would probably be that one. And it really actually, when you start to consider that, you can rethink the entire Tea Party era, what it was really all about, why people were voting for Republican then, why Trump did so well in 2016, and why he won even more votes in 2020.
So we've talked about your political beliefs and your take on the 2020 election. Let's segue a little bit and talk more about your work in the journalism industry. So what is the central goal, in your opinion, of your show, Rising, and why do you think its growth has been so exponential?
I think Rising at its core is just about exposing corruption in elite spaces. And I think that that's why it succeeds, which is that Crystal and I are not really like pushing anything. We are just trying to expose what is going on both in Washington, a city that I'm familiar with, that Crystal is as well. And if corruption happens to touch a side, I would say agree more than not with some elements of the political right. She probably more than not agrees with elements of the political left, but we're not going to ignore facts that are inconvenient for those two sides, especially personally. And I think that that is probably what explains its rise more. Crystal's very willing to call out people who are on the left and on Democrats. I'm very willing to call out people who are on the right and who are Republicans, and vice versa as well. I think at its best, it's an analysis show. It's really just honesty, which you're not going to see on CNN, Fox, or MSNBC. And I think that's why it's done really well.
Yeah. So I think, yeah, in that way, your show is pretty unorthodox. And so, over the last, you've worked in journalism for a long time, and you've sort of seen how things have changed. How do you think the journalism industry has changed, over the last few years since you started working at the Daily Caller?
Yeah,
Was it?
Trump was truly destroyed the industry in a way that I think we really can't get our heads around, which is that I came up in the Obama era, so to speak, right? And so I actually remember a time whenever there wasn't outright hatred from the press corps, both against people who were ideologically against you, like in terms of the press. Like I worked at a conservative outlet, but you could go out and have a drink with somebody who works somewhere else. On January 2017 or November 2016, it was over. It was true, like partisan on the right and on the left. People stopped socializing. People stopped using their critical thinking skills. People began to throw out journalistic norms out the window. many mainstream journalists turned into just outright advocacy people, and many people on the right turned into outright Trumpists. I think the story of the Trump era is everyone was radicalized, everyone. But the problem is that journalism, and mainstream journalists in particular, their entire selling point in terms of their credibility was that we have credibility with both sides. We call it like it is, even though we might have a lean. That's always kind of been bullshit, frankly. But the thing is that the Trump era exposed it in a way with Russiagate and with many of their other misreporting problems, conspiracy theories, lack of fair treatment, and more over 4 entire years. It's just not coming back. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. And so, now I see like CNN and their ratings are down like 47% amongst prime time. It's just like couldn't have happened to nicer people. Fox is the same thing. MSNBC is also suffering. And you made all your news about one guy. If you watch Rising, you guys do. It's not all that about Trump. Like, the show tomorrow, we're going to talk about a union plant closing in Ohio. We did stuff on policy and Medicare for all and debate unions and immigration. And I mean, it's ad nauseum, really, in terms of the different areas. So our viewers don't expect us to only talk about one person, but they did. And it was a fatal mistake that they made. It was great for a temporary period. And now it's over. And now you're going to see just an entire class of people just get wiped out.
So you are touching on what I would call all of the failures of mainstream media today. And we were so excited to ask you about that, particularly because of the way you and Crystal conduct the show. And you are, in a word, different than most of the mainstream media outlets that are on TV every night. You also talked about policy, or you said you were going to talk about policy in the show tomorrow. With that being said, is there one policy you are particularly passionate about right now?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's one policy in particular. I was really passionate about those stimulus checks. I basically, and speaking personally, like my bias, you guys know if you watch the show, I wear it pretty openly on the sleeve. I did everything I could in order to try and get those stimulus checks passed through Congress. I don't think I'm particularly powerful, but anybody who would listen to me, I talked to them about stimulus checks. I made the arguments for why Republicans should vote for them. I made the argument for why conservatives should support it, talked about all the different things. So finally got that through. I think that's fantastic. So child tax credit was another one. That's another thing that passed with the Biden bill. There was a big debate about that one. I thought it was really interesting. One of the more fun debates that I've seen in a long time. Infrastructure is another one I'm actually really passionate about, and I would love to have a real conversation about it, but it's DC, and so that's probably not going to happen. But that won't mean that we won't stop trying. And there are ever-present themes that I always like to look at. Opioids, obviously, just themes that connect to the destruction and the hollowing out of America. Like I said, tomorrow, talking about this UAW, the United Auto Workers coming out saying they're closing a plant in Ohio, or they're not bringing as much investment as they promised. They're moving production down to Mexico. These are the things I care a lot about. I'm staying focused on. The Alabama union fight, that's another one really interested in. There you go.
Great. So you sort of hinted at this with sort of your desire for an infrastructure, some sort of infrastructure public works bill. Wealth equality has gotten much worse over the last year, and it was already pretty terrible to begin with. How do you think the Biden administration and, of course, subsequent administrations should address that in the U.S.?
It's a very tough question. It's interesting. I was not opposed to a wealth tax in principle, but I've been generally convinced that it probably won't work. And also that there are a lot of structural barriers to it in terms of implementation that may not be optimal for capturing the most amount of revenue. And more importantly, like changing the income inequality and structure. So I've taken a look at a lot of different things. Financial transaction tax is actually one of my, peak desires, just simply because people actually don't understand the American financial system, including the regulators. And the more that you do research into it, just in terms of the number and the amount of trades that are happening daily on Wall Street, the amount of like sucking that is occurring from the real economy. And we're talking about billionaires that have been minted off of leeching behavior. That's a very easy way, just in order to target that, number one. And there are like a variety of other different deficit spends you could do, like you said, infrastructure is one where you can change things dramatically. Rural broadband. I mean, these are very basic, kind of boring policies, but which have like massive outside impact in terms of people's opportunity. But I also think, look, we have to change the American higher education financial system, because that is like the number one way that our elite themselves are becoming bankrupt at the same time that people are just over indexing on consumer spending, who are white collar, because that's all that our economy really offers them to do. So we're talking about big structural changes that we have to see.
So, what do you see as the future, and this could be long term or next 4 years, of the Republican Party?
For the Republican Party, they're going to have a really tough time, actually. Joe Biden is not Barack Obama, and he's not Hillary Clinton. People just don't hate him. People do not hate Joe in the way that they hated those two politicians. And Biden is a much more deft politician. This interest, I observed this with interest, these shootings in Atlanta. And I saw Biden come out and say, I'm not going to give any motivation to the shooter until the investigation happens. I can just tell you that wouldn't happen under Barack Obama. Like, I know there would be something about anti-Asian violence and white supremacy. Look, it doesn't matter if you agree or not. That is very polarizing to many people, right? Period. In terms of the code words of what we're talking about, police then and white supremacy, these are all seen in the media and by voters very differently. I think Biden's reluctance to go there, and to go there on almost every cultural flashpoint, is like really a superpower that he has. Did you hear him say anything about Dr. Seuss? Nope. Same thing on the Mr. Potato Head. And again, these are things which the Obama people would have waded into. And I think that there's a big reason why they lost in 2016. So the GOP is really united on the cultural front in opposition to the left. The problem is that they have no uniting policy platform. I observe with great interest. I don't know if you guys even know what earmarks are, because it's been gone for a while. They just brought them back today or yesterday, actually, which is basically the ability to hide stuff within spending bills, for preferential treatment at its most basic level. And that's a really big deal, because that means that the GOP is at war with its own conception of itself. So I don't know if that answered your question. I think you're going to have a tough time. I think it's going to be very difficult to win 75 million votes the way that Donald Trump did. I don't know how they're going to do it, because they don't have the cultural flashpoint of Biden. There's no Black Lives Matter riots, I guess, like for now. That's basically what they need to pray for, is riots, and something like that, because this is basically the only way they can get people to vote for them.
Right. So what are your sort of thoughts on the Biden cabinet? Are there any picks that you're disappointed in? Of course, there was some controversy around Lloyd Austin and the civil military relations, and then of course him being on the board of Raytheon. Were there any that surprised you? Were there any that disappointed you? General thoughts.
Yeah, actually, I think Lloyd Austin is the most egregious one, not just because of the civil military relations, although I do think that that is really important. This is clearly a failure in the U.S. military. This is somebody who was the CENTCOM commander. CENTCOM is Central Command, which is the U.S. Middle East command. He was a total failure whenever he was in CENTCOM. He failed whenever it came to the arming of the Syrian rebels. He's somebody who very clearly has kind of a neoconservative persuasion. He's somebody who has empowered, I think, worst elements of the Pentagon. I read a story of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff breaking down in tears about how if we leave Afghanistan, like women's rights will go back to the Stone Age. I mean, they're just straight up using like identity politics to justify continued occupation of Afghanistan, which is, just disgusting to me on many levels, because I followed conflict for such a long time. I think Lloyd Austin is very much empowering that wing and thinking within elite Pentagon circles. And I think that's a total disaster. He's not somebody who thinks new, somebody pushing very conventional policy within the DOD. And that's the last thing that we needed. It was Trump's biggest failure to rein that in. And now I think they're about to roll Biden on it again.
You mentioned Afghanistan, and speaking of, what are your thoughts on the recent Biden administration airstrike on Syria, and perhaps your thoughts on the Middle East and the U.S. involvement at large?
Syria is a really tough one because it's very complicated, which is that Syria is a sovereign country, right? And where I came from in the 1990s, you don't bomb sovereign nations without explicit authorization from Congress. All of that changed after 9/11 through the authorization of the use of military force. But then, even then, drone strikes and stuff like that was largely limited to places like Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen. Yemen is where things started to get dicey. Mali is when things started to get dicey. Syria is the logical, endpoint of that, with Congress letting all that slide, which is that the leader of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, says you can't strike us, and we do it anyway. And our Congress doesn't do anything about it. So from that perspective, I think it's outrageous. I thought it was outrageous when Trump did it too. Really, whenever you think about it. And I thought that his legal justification, look, I don't like Bashar al-Assad. Like, I enjoyed watching his stuff blow up on the runway, but these are major implications, right? Whenever it comes to U.S. foreign policy. And I actually was in the briefing room. I asked Sarah Sanders, I was like, look, I mean, are you sure that you can even strike somebody under the Chemical Weapons Treaty, the Geneva Convention? I mean, you never get a clear answer on these things. And Congress doesn't really care to ask. I think it's a total disaster. Afghanistan is the same thing. I think that perma war in Afghanistan, probably for the majority of your guys' lifetimes, is a disgrace. And, I've tracked the war for a really, really long time. Same people who were making arguments for staying 10 years ago are saying the exact same thing right now. No accountability. The people who invaded, they have nothing that they can say in terms of their defense. And it's been a total failure on every single level.
So speaking of the Middle East, of course, Iran is sort of related to the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and of course, much more directly involved in Syria. So what do you think? Of course, Biden was, obviously important to the JCPOA and the nuclear deal with Iran, and then Trump was extremely tough on Iran, sort of crippling sanctions. So what do you think the Biden approach to Iran should be? Should it be harden Iran? Should they be pursuing a new sort of nuclear deal? Should they just maintain sanctions?
They're in a tough spot. They're in a tough spot because you got Iranian elections. I think they happen next month, either not next month or the month after. And, they put sanctions on Iran because of what was happening with the Iranian militias in Iraq. Look, this is a thorny problem. I have no idea what the correct answer is. I'm not sure if we can get back into the JCPOA, even though that is the stated position of the Biden administration. Jake Sullivan's one of the people who struck that deal. He's the current national security advisor. But I mean, clock is ticking. Somebody better start meeting in Geneva like now if we want to see something actually happen. I don't see any progress towards that. So I think that stasis is probably the most likely to happen, where there's not going to be any development negatively or positively. But that's actually a big problem because it means that uncertainty remains in the mix.
So what do you think that Gen Z, of which Ryan and I are both members, can do to mend the polarity in our political climate?
That's a really hard question because I can't even figure it out for myself. And I would say that I guess if there's one thing that encourages me about Gen Z is that they do not inherit even a modicum of the brainworms of like listening to traditional media. And so I think that is extraordinarily freeing. I think that people in Gen Z are much more likely to watch shows like mine. And I mean, I see the demographic numbers, like I know who watches it. And there's a lot of people who are in Gen Z who do watch the show. And I think that the rise of new media, which is primarily the ones that is consumed by Gen Z, is one that will just have orders of magnitude just be better for our politics because they'll be exposed to a bunch of different ideas and they won't think of things so much outside of the box the way that the boomers and Gen X in particular do. So I would say, just keep doing what you're doing. Like, I don't know if there's anything necessarily like that I could call for, like, make sure you guys do this or that. Look, I just think that a general commitment to more engagement and civil discourse is what like every generation needs. But the most important thing are like the assumptions that you bring to the table whenever you have a disagreement. And I think that generally, I would say that the rise of new media and Gen Z's consumption of it, that's a net good thing for our politics. But I could be totally wrong.
So you've been doing, bookshelf tours on your Instagram, of course, and so you're very involved with that. What are 3 books that you think every young adult should read?
In politics or in general?
Just in general, whatever.
That's a really hard one. Let's see. What did I read when I was in high school?
Sorry.
I read Ender's Game when I was in high school, and I thought that was great. So that's fiction. I'll always throw some fiction in there, although I don't read fiction anymore. And I would say that a good understanding of the American Civil War can do wonders for you in terms of knowledge of our past. And so from that one, I would say Battle Cry of Freedom. It's a 1-volume book on the American Civil War. I think reading that is a great definition to say, like, this is what it means to be American, and this is what we are, what we were, and now what we're all about. So I think that that's something that all of us should be imbued in. And then the third one, I'll throw one out of the limb here. It's called Man on the Moon, and it's the missions of Apollo. And I'm only saying that because I want more people who are young to understand the majesty of space travel, which we just don't really, because we haven't seen it as excellently in our lifetime. And it shouldn't be something that was generations ago. It's like something that we should make very recent and like now, like known within our own lives.
Those are great recommendations, or I'm sure
Hope
they
so.
are. We'll be sure to check them out. I guess this is just our last question. We ask it to
Sure.
everyone, and I am personally really interested to hear what you have to say. What advice would you give to your 17-year-old self?
Work much harder than you did, and you'll save yourself a lot of headache. That's what I would say, which is that I know it feels really good to watch The Office and to focus on whatever is going on in high school drama, but probably should study for the SATs or your math test instead. And that would probably serve you much better in life. And it would have. And I really wish I had. But it's okay. I ended up learning from my mistakes, but please don't put yourself in a position where you have to learn from your own mistakes. Just do it right the first time. It just feels a lot better.